Hello and welcome to another Geocurrents lecture series. This is a short one, just 2 lectures, and the topic is the myth of continents revisited. In today's lecture, we'll look at the issue of what is a continent, and then we'll examine the matter of where and when the continental model originated. So in 1997, I published the book The Myth of Continents. It was written with my wife, Karen Wigan. It's long been time to revisit the issue, and I've thought about doing this in many different ways. The book was by far the most successful academic publication of mine, and I think it bears revisitation. I got an opportunity to do that in May of 2025 when I was invited to give a lecture in the Stanford Distinguished Faculty Lecture Series in Stanford's Continuing Studies program. I've decided after delivering this lecture to redeliver it and post it on Geocurrents and take the opportunity to enlarge it and make it an expanded lecture in 2 parts. So anyway, getting into the meat of the issue, the most elementary, and I would also say the most problematic geographical lesson in the United States, lesson for students, is that the terrestrial world, is divided into 7 continents. If you look at geographical instruction material for kindergartners or first graders, you'll generally have an exercise in coloring in the continents. If you look at a map, do an image search for a map of continents, you'll find maps of this sort, many different varieties. Occasionally you'll get a map that shows the world divided in a somewhat different manner, but this is standard. So this is considered the most important issue in world geography, at least in a pedagogical sense. Actually, though, it's quite a bit a different situation. The number of continents is not uncontroversial. It's contested. In the United States, the 7-continental model is ubiquitous, but in other countries, not necessarily so. In much of Latin America, for example, South America and North America are considered one continent, America. That doesn't work in the United States, where the term America is usually reserved for the United States. But anyway, there's some Wikipedia maps of different continental schemes. For example, we see the familiar 7-continental scheme of North and South America, Europe and Asia, Africa, Australia, and Antarctica. But then the next one on the right shows a 6-continental scheme where Europe and Asia are combined to form Eurasia, and there are many good reasons for that, as I will discuss later on. Then number 5 shows the scheme with North and South America joined as one continent. And the 4-continental scheme shows Africa and Eurasia as one single continent. You rarely encounter that, but it is certainly a scheme that can be used. But anyway, going back to the 7-continental scheme, there's an implicit definition of what is a continent in this system. And it would be, at least as what I think is the best way to look at this, is that a continent is a very large landmass that is separated or almost separated from other large landmasses by waterways. So Australia and Antarctica are completely separated from other masses of land, large masses of land, by oceanic space. But then elsewhere we find these almost divisions. So North and South America are connected at the Isthmus of Panama, but it's a very narrow connection, and it's actually been cut by a canal. And Africa is connected to Asia by a very narrow isthmus of Suez, which incidentally has also been cut by a canal. So I suppose you could say they're separated by water now, but that's a human-made deviation from the natural norm, if you will. It's also important to note, though, that this definition of continent, the one I gave you, of large masses of land that are separated or almost separated, is by no means universally accepted. And it didn't even come into general use until the 19th century, or to some degree even into the 20th century. What the term continent, which comes from, originated as a Latin term, but what it originally meant was continuous land. And you could see that in the the etymology of the words continent and continuous. Continuous land, in other words, not divided by waterways or other divisions. Or in other words, a mainland, for example. And what we called continents were until the 19th, early 20th centuries, were generally not called continents. They were called parts of the world or divisions of the world. Continent was a much less specific term. And in fact, as the Wikipedia article on continent notes that the very large island of Sumatra in Southeast Asia, in the country of Indonesia, was depicted as a continent as recently as the 18th century. And you can understand this if you view continent as meaning mainland or continuous land. There are a number of smaller islands around Sumatra, and from a Sumatran perspective, Sumatra itself is the mainland, and then you have these islands. You could see them, several of them lying to the west or southwest of Sumatra. More surprising was the very relatively small Isle of Man in between Britain and Ireland, was depicted as a continent as recently as the 17th century. Again, this is in the Wikipedia article on continent. The reference is to the Oxford English Dictionary. You can trace it out there if you want. Kind of surprising that the Isle of Man would be considered a continent, because how is it a mainland? Simply an island in between two much larger, vastly larger islands. The only way it makes sense to me is if you look really closely at a map of the Isle of Man, and you can see a small island to the southwest called, interestingly, the Calf of Man. So I suppose from the perspective of the Isle of Man itself, that is the mainland, the continuous land, and then the island as separating it. At any rate, eventually, an unspecified size threshold for continent emerged. And I say here, evidently somewhere between Greenland and Australia. Greenland is conventionally regarded as the world's largest island. Australia as the smallest continent, and Greenland, you can see, is about a quarter the size of Australia. So Greenland too small to be a continent. Australia generally is credited as a continent. Not always, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But it is important to note that this is the actual size threshold, at least to my knowledge, has never been specified. How large does an island have to be to become a continent? Interestingly, though, there are some who regard this as controversial and argue that Australia is not a continent but is an island. I have here in the slide information from a website called Let's Talk Geography, and I don't want to denigrate this site. It has plenty of good information. In the article, whose headline I have here, and some information posted on this slide. It's not a bad article, but it doesn't begin in a very good way. 5 mind-blowing reasons why asking, is Australia an island? Well, that doesn't make any sense, does it? But I circled in red here 2 points this article makes. Island or continent? The debate rages on. Explore the surprising answer. Well, there's hardly any debate that I'm aware of. I mean, there are a few people who would claim Australia is an island, but it's not exactly a debate, certainly not a scholarly debate. But then the information below that, also with a red line around it, is surrounded by water. Does that make Australia an island? Let's find out. So this would presume, it seems to make the point that continents are not surrounded by islands. Continents are not surrounded by water. So the continuous land masses of America, North and South America, I mean, they are completely surrounded by water. There are islands that are associated with those continents. So on the map, I draw a line around this continuous mass of land, excluding the Canadian archipelago, the Caribbean islands, Tierra del Fuego, and so on. But yes, that is, strictly speaking, an island. There's water all the way around it. And the same with Eurasia and Africa together. If you exclude the islands, that large landmass is continuously surrounded by water. It's kind of difficult to trace it because you have some deep indentations, but it is strictly speaking an island. So if we're going to follow the logic used in that article in the preceding slide, then that would make That would make the Americas and Afro-Eurasia, if you will, that would make them islands that are larger than their constituent continents. So continents are both uh, uh, larger than islands and smaller than them. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? Anyway, by this original definition of a continent as a piece of continuous land, the continent of Europe would then have to exclude the British Isles, as it sometimes does. Well, not framed as the continent of Europe, but rather framed as continental Europe. So we have little slightly different permutations of a term, but they have very different meanings, almost opposite meanings to some sense. So for continental Europe, that would exclude the British Isles, islands in the Mediterranean like Sicily and Corsica, Sardinia, Crete, not be part of continental Europe, nor would the islands of Denmark. So by this definition, Copenhagen, for example, is not situated on continental Europe. And there are many ways in which this usage still is found, and historically it has some importance. For example, in the late 1700s, the sort of newly formed or forming in the process of forming state of the United States explicitly framed itself as a continental state because it's based on a large continuous landmass, North America, and that contrasted against the insular power of the United Kingdom, which is not a continental power, but rather an insular or island power, one way of looking at it. Anyway, this is a remnant definition. Europe as a continent now always includes the nearby islands, as do other continents. So Asia as a continent is always going to include Japan and islands of Indonesia and the Philippines. I never see them excluded from Asia. So Europe as a continent as opposed to continental Europe, or we could say continental Asia too, although I rarely see that. Not sure if I ever have. Or continental North America, which would exclude the Caribbean. So it just seems to be Europe that has this particular locution. But then the question has to be raised as to what does separate Europe from Asia. So this map has Europe in yellow color and a light brown for Asia and Africa. And you can see the boundaries do not follow the political boundaries, which are in red. The boundary is approximately as I have mapped it there. This brings up the key definitional dilemma. So if continents are to be viewed as large land masses that are separated or nearly separated from other land masses by intervening waterways, how then do Asia and Europe count as separate continents? Europe is neither separated nor almost separated from Asia. There's nothing even close to a natural or geophysical separation. What supposedly separates Europe from Asia? Well, if you read textbooks or dictionaries, they'll generally tell you the Ural Mountains. And I have put in text here on this map, Ural Mountains just to the west of the actual mountains, which are located in Russia. And you can see them in a somewhat dark shade. On this map, lowlands are green, and the higher elevation, the more brown it gets. So you can see there's definitely a mountain range separating European Russia from Siberia or Asian Russia. It's not a particularly imposing mountain range, but the Urals are not nearly enough to separate the two continents. Actually, what you have here are the Ural Mountains. I have a black line showing them. And then the conventional definition jumps to the Ural River, which flows into the Caspian Sea. And then the boundary is either in the middle of the Caspian or along its shore. I put along its shore here. And then it jumps to the Caucasus Mountains to the south of Russia, separating Russia from Georgia and Azerbaijan. And then it goes to the Black Sea and then includes all the islands in the Aegean as part of Europe, whereas Anatolia or Asian Minor is framed as part of Asia. So anyway, the most important part of the supposed separation of Europe from Asia are these two mountain ranges, the Ural Mountains and the Caucasus, although not entirely by any means. But that raises an interesting question. So if mountains can separate continents, one must ask why South Asia is considered a subcontinent rather than a continent. So I put a black line showing the South Asian or Indian subcontinent, which includes not just the country of India, but also Bangladesh, most of Pakistan, Nepal, and Bhutan, as well as the islands of Sri Lanka and the Maldives, generally considered South Asia. But the Indian subcontinent is a term that is very commonly used. In fact, people from India are sometimes referred to as subcontinentals in the United Kingdom. Well, mountains really do separate the Indian subcontinent to a significant degree from the rest of Asia. You have the loftiest mountains in the world, the Himalayas, and then the huge Tibetan Plateau, and then the Arakan Yoma separating South Asia from Southeast Asia, the Hindu Kush and other ranges separating it on the northwestern boundary. That's a very profound mountain division, whereas the Urals are not that profound. I put a red circle around the low point in the Ural mountain range, sort of in the central part. The lowest pass is only 320 meters, or about 1,050 feet above sea level. An interesting little historical fact here is when the Russian state began to conquer Siberia, or what we could call Asian Russia, the area to the east of the Ural Mountains in the late 1500s. The Cossacks who led that conquest were able to portage their river boats from Europe to Asia over the mountain pass, just to show how traversable it was. Quite a contrast to the Himalayan mountains, for example. But anyway, this division of Europe from Asia along the Ural Mountains and the main crest of the Caucasus and the Ural River is relatively recent. Geographers have set many different boundaries between the two, and they've been able to do that because they are not, by any stretch of the imagination, separate landmasses. Europe and Asia are one landmass. So we can see a Wikipedia map on the left that shows many different divisions that have been used or proposed. Notice especially in the south here, the various possibilities. Today we generally use the crest of the Caucasus mountain range, but other boundaries have been put in other geophysical features, either north or south of those mountains. So it's not something that there's been a tremendous amount of scholarly consensus, although it's often treated as if there were more consensus than there is. So now we get the big question. Why is Eurasia divided into two continents if they are not by any stretch of the imagination separate land masses? Well, the answer is pretty simple and pretty profound, I think. And that is, at least in my view, is because the Europe-Asia distinction is intrinsic to the underlying model. That's how the idea that was eventually translated into the term continent, or divisions of the world or parts of the world, that was where it began intellectually. So there was an ancient division of the world into two parts, Europe and Asia, and that gave rise to the continental scheme as other continents were added. And it was based on division between two land masses by waterways, but it was created by people who had a very limited knowledge and understanding of the world, and that part of the world they knew, it looked like there was this division. So basically we're talking about ancient Greece here. That was where the continental notion, again, continent is not their term, they viewed it as parts of the world or divisions of the world. But it was ancient Greek thinkers, geographers, who made this first distinction. And it was rooted in ancient Greek trade and settlement in the Black Sea region. So this National Geographic map shows sort of what was Greece proper at this time, 750 to 550 BC or BCE. Both what is today Greece and the far western part of what is today Turkey. It also shows Greek colonies. It exaggerates them. Those are in orange because these were basically just coastal cities. But around much of the northern Mediterranean, southern Italy, but you can see pretty much all around the Black Sea. And the Black Sea was a very important area for Greek culture, both in the earlier Bronze Age and then later on in the classical period. And you could see its importance in Greek myth and legend. For example, the story of Jason and the Golden Fleece, or Jason and the Argonauts being the sailors on his ship, the Argo. And this is really sort of it's a mythical account, a legendary account, and may have had some rooting in actual historical events back in the Bronze Age, which was ended around the year 1100 BC or BCE. During the Bronze Age, Greece had a number of important city-states. It had a literate culture and a pretty sophisticated one with very powerful citadels ruled by small-scale kings. But the Greeks were active at that time and were sailing into the Black Sea, a very resource-rich area, I should add. Another semi-legendary or legendary account of the Greeks showing the importance of this really would be the Iliad, written by Homer. Although we're not sure who wrote it. Well, actually, it was most likely an oral legend for centuries, probably until it was finally put into writing. And it is a recount of a major war between various Greek city-states in the late Bronze Age against Troy, a city that commanded the entrance to the Dardanelles or the Hellespont, the first of two narrow waterways that one had to take to get from the Aegean Sea, which is the core of Greek civilization, ultimately into the Black Sea. So Troy occupied a very important position. According to the Iliad, the war was over the abduction of Helen, most beautiful woman in the world, daughter of a goddess, if I remember right. I was abducted by Paris and taken to Troy, and this was a great war of all sorts of small-scale Greek cities to win her back, which ultimately happened. So there's been a lot of debate over whether this was rooted in actual historical events, but it seems likely to me that there was something on that line because Troy, what we think was the city of Troy, had this very important position at the entrance to the waterways that would take people into the Black Sea. But anyway, if indeed the Iliad was an account of some sort of historical event, eventually this world of the Bronze Age was going to collapse. That happened in maybe the 1100s BCE. There were massive incursions of violent invaders called the Sea Peoples. All of those Greek citadels were overthrown. Greek society underwent a simplification. Literacy was lost for a few hundred-year period. And so many scholars think that the Iliad was a sort of a remembrance of this earlier Bronze Age period by people who lived in a much more world of much smaller scale social interactions and without literacy, as simply as an oral legend for many years. But getting back to making the actual distinction between Europe and Asia, it seems to have first been made in the 6th century of the 500s BC or BCE in what was known as Ionia. This very interesting map shows ancient Greek dialect groups. They could understand each other, but they had different dialects, and you could see how maritime the Greek peoples were because you can see the Aeolian dialect in the north, the Ionian and the Dorian, all spanning both sides of the Aegean Sea. So the Ionian dialect spoken in Attica, Athens, for example, but also in a number of cities located in what is now the far western part of Turkey. And the beginning of Greek philosophy took place in Ionia, the area that I've put a red oval around. And it was Ionians who made the distinction between Europe and Asia. And I have also put in on this map a red arrow showing more or less the sea route from the city of Miletus, most important of these Ionian cities, into the Black Sea. So at any rate, something very interesting was happening in ancient Greece, well, and particularly in Ionia in the 500s, well, starting in the late 600s, probably BCE. Uh, Literacy had been recovered, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And a number of thinkers started to develop, well, what we would later become philosophy, or literally means the love of wisdom, or we could even say science. So I've borrowed here a slide from a site on ancient Greek philosophy on what is called the Ionian Enlightenment. So the first philosophers from Ionia, their works only survive in fragments. None of them survive as a whole, but later Greek writers quoted them elaborately, so we have a pretty good idea of what they were about. They were very interested in trying to understand the structure of the universe, what is the ultimate nature of reality. They are sometimes considered the earliest scientists or philosophers. That's quite controversial, as they borrowed a lot of their mathematics, for example, from Egypt, from Babylonia. But they were noted for their writings and for, well, as this slide shows, some of the first thinkers to abandon supernatural or religious explanations. And if you go back to the Iliad and the Odyssey, the gods are pulling the strings everywhere you look. But for the Ionian thinkers of the Ionian Enlightenment, they were looking for naturalistic causes. Now, as the slide says, they were not the first in the world to do this. Interestingly, somewhat similar things were happening in northern India, arguably in northern China as well. Sometimes this period is called the Axial Age. This would be the 500s BC, maybe starting in the 800s, going to the 200s, when in a number of different parts of the world there was this movement to kind of move away from traditional mythical understanding of the world and to try to have a more rationalistic sense and to try to develop systems of ethical thought and so on. So anyway, it's happening in several places, but very strongly in Ionia, and that's what sort of led to the Western intellectual tradition, if you will. This Ionian Enlightenment is often associated with Thales of Miletus, sometimes called the first Greek philosopher. You can see the dates of his life, 626 or so BC to about 548. And this is, it's 100 years before the flowering of thought and in ancient Athens in the Periclean age. So it was this very early period. Thales is credited with a number of mathematical, geometrical ideas, theses and proofs, theorems, if you will. Although some claim that he actually acquired a lot of those ideas in Egypt, perhaps even in Mesopotamia. We're really not certain about this at all. Ancient Greeks wrote about him a lot, but remember, none of his works survived. But back to our main story. It was people from Miletus, where Thales and most of these other Ionian Enlightenment figures lived and wrote. And Miletus had established colonies all around the Black Sea. This is a part of a much larger Greek colonization movement at this time. The Greek mainland had become, mainland and the Ionian area had become overpopulated. And so what city-states would do would establish sort of daughter cities in various different places in southern Italy, Sicily, Marseille in France was originally a Greek settlement. Emporium in what is now Spain was as well. So this was part of a much broader movement, but different city-states sent their colonists in different places. In Miletus, it was mostly into the Black Sea, and there were these separate city-states that were established. They ruled themselves. It wasn't an empire of any sort. They were autonomous, but they maintained tight trade connections. You can see them all around. So as one sailed from Miletus into the Black Sea, One would go from one waterway, a narrow passage, into a broader waterway, another narrow passage into the Black Sea. I'll show you a map in a few minutes that shows that better. But it really did sort of appear that the world, their known world, the world they operated in, was divided into these two parts. And so that in the west deemed Europe and that in the east deemed Asia. Nobody knows where these names came from. There's been a lot of speculation. It seems like scholarly consensus now is that Europe derives from the what was then called the Evros, or now the Maritsa River, flowing from Bulgaria and then dividing European Turkey from Greece, at least to some extent. And then Asia, perhaps from the what was called in the Suwa League. This was a league of city-states. It's dated back to the Bronze Age. It was referred to in Hittite archives. The Hittites were rulers of central Anatolia. And so it's sort of a convenient location on either side of this maritime passageway. So that may have given the names. Like I say, that's still controversial. And then the first Greek geographers who talked about Europe and Asia divided them in the east along the what was called the Phasis, today the Rioni River in the Republic of Georgia. And incidentally, that is precisely where Jason and the Argonauts supposedly went to acquire the Golden Fleece, which many think the fleece was used for extracting gold from river sediments in sort of a panning process, and that may have given rise to it. But so that area was well known sort of in legendary or mythological terms, and it's sort of the far end of the Black Sea, and so originally that was the division. Now, there are other ideas about where the term Europe came from, and the most prominent would probably be from the mythical princess Europa. So Europa was not Greek. She was Phoenician. The Phoenicians and the Greeks were often competitors, so they traded with and cooperated a lot as well. Phoenicia, basically what is today Lebanon, certainly part of Asia by the conventional continental scheme, particularly from the city of Tyre, which was one of the most important Phoenician cities. And the Phoenicians were fantastic mariners, merchants, traders. They also developed an alphabet, and it's almost certain that Greece reacquired literacy from Phoenicians. If you look closely at this map, which I've borrowed here from the site Greek Myths, Greek Mythology, it shows the spread of literacy, the spread of the Phoenician alphabet in that thick blue line. So anyway, the legend of Europa was that she was this princess from this very important, powerful trading city of Tyre. She was abducted by Zeus, who disguised himself as a white bull, and then took to the sky and took her to the isle of Crete, which at this time was a Greek-speaking island. Not on the European mainland, though, obviously. And if I recall correctly, she supposedly gave birth to King Minos, and the earlier pre-Greek inhabitants of Crete were known as Minoans, but that was way back in the earlier Bronze Age. So anyway, Greece, probably around 700 or so, reacquired literacy. They took the Phoenician alphabet, they changed it, they added vowels. The Greek were the first to add vowels. And so Greek literature is reborn, and the oral stories of credited to Homer are written down. And a few hundred years later, Greeks in Ionia, the eastern part of that red area, again we're showing the Greek dialects, start to write speculative philosophy, start to write geography, and so on. So this is it would be quite interesting if this is the source of the term Europe, because it is Europa was not from Europe and was not taken to the European mainland. One other thing I would mention in this same legend, Europa was she had three brothers who tried to find her. One of whom was named Cadmus, And Cadmus was credited for founding the important Greek city of Thebes and for introducing literacy to Greece. So this is an interesting story that connects Greece not to the Black Sea. Sorry, connects Europe not to the Black Sea, but to the Eastern Mediterranean and Phoenicia. But getting back to the main story, later Greek geographers took this idea of Europe versus Asia and made some adjustments. One was they moved the boundary from the Phasis or Ionian River in what is now Republic of Georgia to what today we call the Straits of Kerch or the Cimmerian Bosporus, another very narrow passageway separating the Crimean Peninsula and from the opposite shore, and then leading to the Sea of Azov, which is a very shallow sea, but very rich in fisheries. And this was very important even for Athens at its imperial heyday. A lot of dried fish as well as grain, wheat, came from that area. So it was very important for the ancient Athenians to maintain close ties to whoever controlled this Cimmerian Bosporus to get access to those very important resources. But anyway, with the movement to the Straits of Kerch, and then beyond that to another river, what's then called the Tanais, today the Don River, was taken then as a sort of a further extension of that boundary. So again, if your horizons are sort of limited to this area, it did look like the world was divided into two different parts. Greek geographical knowledge expanded. More knowledge was gained, and there were other scholars who were able to refine this model. So here we have two reconstructions, and it's very important to note none of the maps made by these early Ionian geographers survived. None of their writings survived, certainly none of their maps. So these are reconstructions based on fragments of their work cited by later Greek scholars. But you could see Anaximander of Miletus. Most of these scholars are all from or operated in this, what had been this very important city of Miletus. I had this division here with, he knew about the Mediterranean, as did other Greeks, but that was joined with Asia. I should say North Africa was joined, the southern part of the Mediterranean. And so we see this sort of division. It's interesting. You can see the Nile River as separating them. So this shows a somewhat limited base of geographical knowledge to the extent that this reconstruction is accurately depicts Anaximander's actual view. It's really hard to say. Ancient Greek scholars thought there was the river ocean, which surrounded the landmass of the world. And then other rivers were connected to it. So pretty crude geographical knowledge, but it increases. But we can see the Mediterranean Sea, then the Black Sea, and the Phasis River separating these two continents. And then a few decades later, Hecataeus, who was better noted as a geographer, again, his work doesn't survive, but who reorganized this scheme, adds what the Greeks called Libya, the Romans later called Africa, as a third division of the world. And so this reconstructed map, to the extent that it's accurate, accurately depicts what they thought or knew, I should say, shows sort of a significant advance. The Red Sea is on this map, which later was taken as the divide between Africa or Libya and Asia. Although, oddly enough, the Nile continued to be used as the division in different sources for a long period of time. But you could see, according to this map anyway, Hecataeus' view was that the world was sort of separated into three separate land masses by waterways and some mountains as well. Later in the following century, Herodotus, often considered the father of geography, the father of history, the father of anthropology, who wrote this huge and very important tome that survives today called the Histories, recounting the Greek wars against the Persian Empire, but with extensive geographical excursions, and a lot of geographical description and depiction. But Herodotus very clearly just scoffed at the notion that the world is divided into three parts. He says that We really don't know it's divided. We don't know what exists in these areas far to the north and the south. We can just sort of imagine them, but we don't know really what's there. And he says, I have no idea why they use three women's names to depict these land masses. Today, most scholars don't think they came from women's names, but Herodotus at the time did. And even though Herodotus' work survived, there are no maps that he made, at least that survived. There are no maps at all that survived from ancient Greece. We know they made maps. They described them, but they didn't survive, so we have to sort of reconstruct them. But anyway, Herodotus just sort of scoffed at this division of the world into three parts, of Europe, Libya, and Asia, but he used it. He sort of had to. I scoff at the continental scheme, but I still use it. It's impossible to get away from it. Herodotus has also been accused of politicizing it, contrasting Asian tyranny with European liberty. I don't think that's fair. I have read Herodotus pretty extensively, and he certainly contrasts the tyranny of the Persian Empire against the relative liberty of Greek city-states, but I don't see any real evidence that this is a continental distinction. He didn't think in continental terms, so he certainly wouldn't be able to politicize it like so. But the Persian Empire did control most of what was then considered or known as Asia, so one can kind of understand why this distinction was made. And also, the ancient Greeks at this time, they didn't consider Greece or the realm of the Greek-speaking peoples to be part of Europe. After all, some of the most important Greek city-states, what had been city-states until they were conquered by the Persian Empire, they were located in Asia. So the Greeks did not view themselves as European as opposed to Asians. Not at all. The Greeks, people themselves, spanned that divide. They were the distribution of their city-state settlements was maritime, not continentally based. The Romans took this Greek geographical conceptualization and used it as well. Roman maps don't survive either. They have to be reconstructed. We definitely have a lot of geographical works produced in the Roman Empire, both by Latin and Greek speakers and writers. So they have to be reconstructed, but they sort of can. So here's a reconstruction of an ancient Roman map, which I've taken from a Reddit subreddit called Map Porn, actually a very useful site. And so you can basically see the Mediterranean separating Europe in the north from Africa, a term that the Romans used in the south. And then pretty distorted view, though, but going up into the Aegean Sea, the Sea of Marmara, the Black Sea, the Sea of Azov, up to the far north, seemingly separating or almost separating. We're back to the almost separating Europe from Asia. And then the Red Sea, almost separating Asia from Africa. So roughly dividing the world into three roughly equal parts. So this tripartite division of the world. After the fall of the Roman Empire, there's certainly a regression of knowledge, a loss of a lot of knowledge, but this threefold distinction continued to be made. A number of early Christian writers simplified it and sacralized it. In other words, turned it into a religious image of the world. And these there are dozens of surviving medieval TO maps. They're called TO maps because we have an O. And if you remember from those earlier maps of ancient Greek, Ionian geographers, there was kind of a circular vision of the world, the known world, with Oceanus, or the ocean, sort of flowing around it at the edge. To understand these TO maps, it's best to view them not with the north at the top, which the one on the left shows. That is the way we orient maps, but it was more common in the Middle Ages have east at the top rather than north. So I've taken another one that shows east of the top. So you can see the Mare Magnum, or the Mediterranean, and the Tanais or Don River, and the Nilus or Nile River. It's interesting they're going back to the rivers. But in the one on the right, with east at the top, you can see that inscribed a cross, Jerusalem, right at the center of the cross. And they also often have in these TO, these very simple maps, or orbs as it's sometimes called, will show other biblical features such as paradise here in the far east, and so on. So these are religious emblems. They were not the some extent not exactly maps, although maps of a sort. And as the medieval period went on, more complicated maps are made. One of the most impressive is something called the Hereford Mappa Mundi from Hereford in England, a late medieval map. A huge map, reproduction there shown on the left, and it's kind of hard to understand what's going on. But I want to talk about the Hereford map for a second, because the point sort of that it makes is that continents were used, what we now call continents, divisions of the world, this threefold division of the world was used, but it wasn't necessarily sort of even understood. It was kind of vague in the minds of a lot of even geographers who were making world maps, Mappa Mundi. For example, if we take the Hereford world map and rotate it, and I put some labels in so you can understand it, we have the Mediterranean Sea. So I have north, oriented so north is on the top. So in green we have waterways here, except the Red Sea, which was red. And this is actually very common in medieval and even early modern maps to color the Red Sea in a red color. But otherwise the waterways are, in this particular version, are essentially in green. You can see the Mediterranean Sea and you can see the Black Sea. You can see also the islands of Britain and Ireland sort of squished in the northwestern part. But on this map, the labels for Africa and Europe are inverted. Africa is put over what is Europe, and Europe over what is Africa. So you could think of this as a grave mistake, but it also indicates that these ideas are sort of in the background, but they were not necessarily understood or did not necessarily really used for global depiction. After the voyages of Columbus and Magellan and Vasco da Gama and others, when in the late 1400s and early 1500s, Europeans crossed the Atlantic Ocean, sailed into the Indian Ocean, crossed the Pacific eventually. That led to what Eviatar Zerubbabel calls in his fascinating book, Terra Cognita, The Mental Discovery of America. Anyway, he calls cosmographic shock, because this notion that the world was divided into three parts had taken on all these religious underpinnings. Three parts kind of might be reflect the Trinity. You have this idea of Jerusalem at the center of the world and so on. But suddenly, well, not only is Jerusalem nowhere near the center, but we have eventually discovered another huge part of the world. Now, at first, this was just considered part of Asia. That's certainly what Columbus thought. In particular, India. Now, I should say, though, not India as we understand it as a country, but the Indian subcontinent and areas further to its east. I'll talk about that later on in this lecture series. That what today we call Southeast Asia was considered farther or further India. The islands of Southeast Asia, of Indonesia and the Philippines, were considered the Indies, the islands of India. India was, to a large extent, in the European medieval imagination, just sort of the ultimate East. And a little fascinating, I think, and ironic tidbit was that for Japanese medieval scholars, and into the early modern period, India, what they viewed as India, what they called India, was the ultimate West. And when the Portuguese first sailed into Japan, in the mid-1500s, the Japanese and the Portuguese each sort of considered each other Indians, or people from South Asia. the Portuguese ending up in the ultimate east, and the Japanese viewing the Portuguese as coming from the ultimate west, which essentially they did. So anyway, this cosmographic shock took some time to overcome, but eventually the tripartite division of the world was abandoned, and instead they moved to the four quarters of the world, 4 parts of the world. Europe, Asia, Africa, which had been there all along, and then the Americas added as another. This is a map from Abraham Ortelius, who really devised the first atlas in the late 1500s. It shows North America and Asia as divided, but not necessarily. Nobody knew that for sure at the time, and there's actually a pretty narrow separation in the Bering Strait between the two. And the map is actually colored, putting both Asia and the Americas in the same sort of tint. But maps were at this time colored by someone separate from the actual cartographer. The maps were engraved or etched, and then someone colored them in. So it's hard to know what the colors really meant. But anyway, by the late 1500s, it's pretty well established that there are not 3 main divisions of the world, but 4. And then there's a hypothesized 5th, Terra Australis. So you can see in this map of Ortelius, you have this huge southern landmass. Australia had just sort of been touched upon. In this map, New Guinea is actually a separate map. You can see on the far, a separate island, and with the green boundary on the far left-hand side of the map, and then this huge Terra Australis. It was hypothesized largely because there was a thought that the land masses had to be balanced, and you couldn't have most of the land in the northern hemisphere, which is actually the case. And so eventually, although it took a long time for Australia to be mapped as a separate huge island, or what eventually became a continent, and the same with Antarctica. I'll talk about that in a second. So anyway, you end up with a 4-fold continental model, maybe then a 5th-fold, a 5-fold, and that will change as North and South America are separated, but it's Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, and then later separating them, and then adding Australia, adding Antarctica to get to 7. But it's important to realize how long it took for this model to become established, and the fact that the term continent was not used. So I'll just give you an example here from a school geography textbook in the United States, 1853. Mitchell School Geography were a very important series of textbooks, and it purports to be a system of modern geography with a description of the world in its 5 great divisions. So we have America, that's North and South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, and then Oceania. Oceania is sort of a quasi-continent where Australia and all the islands of the Pacific are sort of thrown in together. But I've taken one page from this book and I've put red boxes around some important passages. So one is the world comprises 5 great divisions, and he names them. And each are divided into politically. And then America is a great continent entirely separated from other parts of the world. So by America, North and South America. It is often called the New World, or also the Western Continent. And then a little bit below, Asia is the largest division and comprises more than 1/2 of the Eastern Continent. So you have an eastern continent, which is essentially Eurasia and Africa. So this is a definition of continents that are huge masses of land entirely surrounded by water. So it would separate the islands from the continents. So it's using the old definition of continent as continuous land in a quite literal sense. But that literal sense doesn't work with the Asia-Africa division. So he's calling them divisions of the world. And to get to the 7-continent scheme, it really didn't become standard in the United States until the early 20th century. So I have here a map from the year 1900, if you read carefully in the caption there from the New York Public Library. And it is using color and it's separating, whoever colored in these plates, separating North America from South America. Again, we have Africa, Asia, and Europe. We have Australia as a separate continent or land mass, not specified what they're actually to be called. But note there's no Antarctica, which is kind of bizarre because by the middle 1800s, the existence of Antarctica was pretty well known. But it's easy to ignore Antarctica considering that it doesn't have any human habitation, hardly has macroscopic life other than seabirds and seals around the edges of it. So this very standard notion that we have that every grade school student is taught that the world is divided into 7 continents, that really is an early 20th century development. And it becomes standard and it becomes deeply ingrained. Although, as I will talk about in the second part of this lecture, which will be delivered separately, the continental scheme already began to collapse in the mid-20th century, at least among serious scholars. So it did not have a very long period when geographical textbooks, for example, were organized around 7 continents of the world. That was a short period. But there are a lot of interesting questions to consider. Why did the 7-continental model prevail in most countries? Not everywhere, but certainly in the United States and most European countries, we have this 7-continental model. One idea is because it's just due to the significance of the number 7. As this slide from Interesting Literature notes, after 3, 7 is perhaps the number that is filled with the most religious significance around the world. And I should say it's not just in Europe. You find in the Middle East, you find in East Asia the same sort of fixation on the number 7. But anyway, just some examples that are given here. The 7 deadly sins, 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, 7 virtues, 7 liberal arts, 7 ages of man. There's 7 wonders of the world, 7 days of the week. One could go on and on with the significance of the number 7. Nobody really knows why 7 has been given such significance in a number of different cultures. All 7 numbers in a telephone digit, for example, without the area code at any rate. But it was, I have here that George Miller demonstrated, I don't know if demonstrated is the right word anyway, hypothesized and gave some evidence for that hypothesis that most people can retain roughly 7 items of information in short-term memory. I'm not sure to the extent of which that is true, but it is a very interesting question of why 7 has come to have such significance in a number of different parts of the world. And I think that's probably something that led to this idea that there are going to be 7 continents. Another idea that you often see is that it stems from a heritage of Eurocentric thought. I have a modified Vox map. I had to modify it here, but because there were a few errors on it. But it has Europe as conventionally defined in purple here, and then in green, areas that had been colonized or controlled at one point or another by Europe, and then in other colors had partial European control or European spheres of influence or part of European countries today. You could see, with the exception of Japan, North and South Korea, Thailand, Ethiopia, and Turkey, all the rest of the world had been either colonized or heavily influenced, under European hegemony, if you will. So Europe had, by the mid-1800s, had reached this position of tremendous global importance, able to dominate most of the world. And so this idea then would lead to the further idea that Europe has to maintain its position as a separate continent, even though it is not actually a different continent in terms of the primary definition of continent, but because of the power, historical power and significance of Europe, it has to be given this continental distinction. And then if you look at other large areas of land that are separated or almost separated by other areas, then you come up with 7. So anyway, I don't think we could look at this as one of these answers is the right one and the other is the wrong one. I don't think you can really answer the question of why 7 continents came to occupy the position that they did. But anyway, whatever the reasons for it, it is both ubiquitous, especially in early education, geographical education, but it's also, I put here, quite starkly, a worthless conceptual mess. I think I've established some of the reasons for that conceptual mess in today's lecture. And in the next lecture, I'll talk about why it's worthless, why scholars and diplomats and serious thinkers never talk about Asia as a continent or Asian people as a group of people, or Africa for that matter. It doesn't work in biology. It doesn't work in human affairs at all. Geologically speaking, there is something to it, but far more complicated. And the 7 continental model doesn't work in geology either. I'll talk about that in the next lecture. But we do have these ubiquitous coloring exercises. I've been thinking a lot lately about early geographical education, how young children are exposed to geography, and I've been looking at various textbooks that they're given, and they all have this 7 continental model, at least everyone I've looked at, and they almost all have these coloring exercises. This is for kindergartners and first graders, but they almost never give a definition of what is a continent. They never talk about the fact that Europe and Asia are on the same land mass. They're just sort of given to students this is an established fact when this is a very problematic model of the world that is not used by serious thinkers. And at a very short period when it was. And just to focus in on this map, I think this would be a very frustrating exercise. You can see how crude the map is on the left. And you're supposed to look at that map and take out your crayons and then look at the smaller maps below it showing Asia and Europe and color them in. Well, I'm going to try it out on a few kindergartners before too long and see how well they do. But I don't think it would be easy at all because you look at those 3 maps and they don't really fit together. So I think if we're going to reform geographical education, which I think is a compelling need, I really think we have to start in kindergarten with the lessons of continents. But anyway, that's it for this first half of the lecture. The second lecture will delve into the geological definition of continent, which is quite distinctive and very complicated and has some bearing on our division of the world into 7 continents, but doesn't really fit. It fits in certain areas. And then I'll discuss why the continental model is not useful for dividing the world, even for understanding of biogeography, of the distribution of life, animals and plants, and for human geography, for different features of the human world. It just doesn't work, and that's why it isn't used. And I'll talk about the main alternative for the human world. It doesn't work for biogeography, but for human geography it does, which is called the world regional system or world regional alternative, which is kind of based on continents, but is very distinctive and is not a continental model at all, although it uses continental nomenclature. So that will be the next lecture. I have here on this slide, I'm sorry, June 2, but I'm hoping to deliver that lecture on June 21, 2025, and then post it there. Thank you for listening, and I hope you will listen to the second lecture in this very short series.